Hello and welcome to Just Have a Think. My name's Dave Borlace and I'm on a mission to find out how human activities have resulted in the CO2 emissions that are rapidly warming our environment. Over the last few weeks I've also been looking at some of the alarming consequences that these rising temperatures seem to be inflicting on some of the more vulnerable areas of our planet. And I've been trying to understand what incremental changes you and I can make as individuals and on a collective basis to try and alleviate our impact on the climate and environment. It turns out that it really comes down to three very simple things: how you power your home, how you power your transport, and how you power yourself, in other words, what you eat. These three areas of daily life currently account for 80% of all the carbon emissions into our atmosphere. Most rationally minded people do understand that CO2 emissions from human activity need to go down, but do we really know how enormous the reduction needs to be if we're to stand any chance of avoiding a dangerous disintegration of our global infrastructure through the course of the 21st century? And in any case, CO2 emissions from human activity aren't going down at all. They're not even levelling off. They're going up every year. Last year saw another 2% increase. For more than 2 decades now, the United Nations has been spearheading efforts to try to understand and respond to the changes in our climate. And in April 2018, it released its first ever climate change annual report. So in this and the next couple of programmes, I'm going to take a look at what their conclusions are and what challenges lie ahead of us. This is Patricia Espinosa. She should be a household name and you should be moaning that she's never off the damn TV because she's the United Nations Climate Change Executive Secretary. But I've never heard of her and I suspect you haven't either. Here's what she had to say on page 2 of the report entitled Highlights of 2017. She said, "Our planet is warming. An astonishing 17 of the 18 warmest years on record have occurred in the 21st century. The past 3 years were the hottest since records began. With this warming comes climate change, causing extreme storms, droughts and floods. We witnessed these climate disasters many times in 2017 and were shocked. Yet these are only the most dramatic and visible impacts. Other upheavals range from reduced crop productivity to forced migration. Climate change is the single biggest threat to life, security and prosperity on Earth." As if to emphasise Patricia's fine words, here we are in July 2018 in the middle of a global heatwave. This map shows maximum temperatures on the 14th of July 2018. The white hot areas across Africa and the Middle East are temperatures over 50 degrees Celsius. Even way back in April, a new record highest temperature of 50.2 degrees Celsius or 122.3 degrees Fahrenheit was set for that month in Nawab Shah, Pakistan. These are temperatures that will kill an unprotected human in just a few hours. And as a result of the hugely increased amounts of moisture in the hotter atmosphere, all over the globe millions of people's lives are being disrupted by catastrophic flooding events that never make the evening news over here because, well, the floods occurred in an oddly named country very far away and no Westerners were reported injured in the event. But on July the 5th, Japan was hit by the worst flooding it has seen in nearly 40 years. And probably because they're the third biggest economy in the world, the news editors in the West have deemed this event worthy of a mention. More than 200 people have been killed and 2 million have been evacuated in this emergency. That's like moving the combined population of Birmingham, Manchester and Liverpool out of their cities and trying to house all those people somewhere else in Britain within 24 hours. No more than 10 years or so ago, the idea that we might have to adapt the way we live to accommodate climate change was an absolute non-starter and never discussed at intergovernmental climate conferences. But the global temperature rise continued to accelerate. So by the time we reached the Paris Agreement in 2015, it was clear that we not only needed to take swift and decisive action to reduce carbon emissions and probably even try to remove some existing CO2 from the atmosphere, but we also had to accept the fact that the consequences of climate change were already being felt in many parts of the world. There are 3 fundamental pillars of the United Nations Climate Change Initiative. The first 2 are the Paris Agreement itself, which we'll look at in a minute, and the Sustainable Development Goals, which we've touched on in previous programmes. But the United Nations also recognises the already existing climate change impacts that I just mentioned, and so the third pillar is something called the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. Let's have a look at the Paris Agreement first of all. The agreement followed on from the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, which committed 36 industrial countries plus the EU to reducing emissions by 5% compared to the 1990 levels. Those countries had actually reduced their emissions by 23% by 2012. The trouble is, the countries not participating in Kyoto did this. So in Paris in 2015, 51 countries, including the United States under the Obama administration and China under the leadership of President Xi Jinping, pledged what was phrased as their best efforts in nationally determined contributions. The stated aim of Paris is to limit global temperature rises to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, with a target of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Donald Trump thinks he's pulled out of the Paris Agreement, but in fact the United States can't actually withdraw from the agreement until the 4th of November 2020, which is exactly 4 years after the agreement was formally signed and coincidentally one day after the 2020 US presidential election. And in any case, 20 American states have already publicly declared that they're going to ignore Trump's delusional lunacy and strive to achieve the Paris targets anyway. So it would appear that they are in agreement with Robert De Niro's recent analysis of the current president.
I'm going to say one thing, F*** Trump.
At the other end of the spectrum, there is a great deal of scepticism amongst the scientific community about whether either of the Paris climate targets are at all realistic, given the relentless upward trend in global emissions and temperatures. So at COP23 in Fiji in 2017, a supplementary initiative was put in place called the Talon Dialogue. Talon is a concept from the Pacific Islands of storytelling that leads to consensus building and decision making. It's a process allowing participants to share their stories in an open and inclusive environment with no blame culture, in the hope that others can learn and benefit from their ideas and experiences. Aww. Ridiculously idealistic? Well, we're up against it here, folks, so to paraphrase a well-known UK supermarket, every little helps. And actually, on a more pragmatic level, crucially, Talon also brings in non-state actors like business and industry, as well as Indigenous people for the first time, to actively participate and submit their ideas for how national governments can improve their emissions reductions targets. As a result of Talon, at COP24 in Katowice in Poland at the end of this year, global leaders will be expected to outline how they intend to increase their commitments under a programme that they call Nationally Determined Contributions. These Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs, are submitted every 5 years to the United Nations, with the next round officially due in 2020, but now with this new review in 2018. There's a UN webpage containing a registry of initial NDC submissions by all participating nations in the Paris Agreement, including the US and China. All sounds very laudable. So what does the UN Annual Climate Change Report conclude? Here's their summary. It said, at the request of parties, UN climate change analysed the aggregate effect of planned mitigation actions under the Paris Agreement. The latest analysis, covering 189 countries and about 99% of the emissions of parties to the Convention, found that implementation of the Paris Agreement would lead to lower emissions than were expected before the Paris Agreement. Specifically, 2.8 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent lower in 2025 and 3.3 billion tonnes lower in 2030. These levels, however, are not enough to put the world on track to limit global temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius. The inescapable fact is that we're getting close to a point where the climate is starting to career out of control, and it's already causing weather chaos all over the planet. And that brings us back to the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction that we talked about earlier on. This is the third pillar of the United Nations Climate Change Initiative. The Sendai framework sets out 7 global targets. Number 1, substantially reduce global disaster mortality by 2030. Number 2, substantially reduce the number of affected people globally by 2030. Number 3, reduce direct disaster economic loss in relation to global gross domestic product by 2030. Number 4, substantially reduce disaster damage to critical infrastructure and disruption of basic services like health and education by 2030. Number 5, substantially increase the number of countries with national and local disaster risk reduction strategies by 2020. Number 6, substantially enhance international cooperation for developing countries by 2030. And number 7, substantially increase the availability of and access to multi-hazard early warning systems and disaster risk information and assessments to the people by 2030. As the UN report points out, millions of people in developing countries have already suffered loss and damage from climate change impacts and have been unable to recoup their losses because they can't afford to get climate risk insurance. These climate-induced disasters force 26 million people into poverty every year, and in turn this forces countries to frequently divert long-term development finance into short-term response measures. In November 2017, the Insure Resilience Global Partnership for Climate and Disaster Risk Finance and Insurance Solutions was officially launched at COP23. Essentially, it puts governments and project leaders in developing countries in direct contact with experts and advisors from the developed nations through interactive mechanisms like Risk Talk, which enables anyone to go online and ask a question which will then be directed to the most appropriate expert to answer. This webpage shows the initiatives that are already going on around the globe. The countries are colour-coded depending on how well prepared they are for disaster management. Dark grey is very well prepared, and the dark taupe colour represents very little preparation or readiness at all. Each flag is a clickable link to an ongoing finance and insurance initiative in that particular country. I'll leave a link to this page in the description box below so you can go and navigate it for yourself. I think any remaining climate skeptics should spend some time talking to some of the people affected in these developing nations. As we all sit in our Western affluence and comfort and security, it's easy to be sceptical about climate change and complacent about what we all need to do to change our ways. In the meantime, there's a massive amount of work going on all over the world to combat the existential threat to life that humans and animals now face on a daily basis in countries less fortunate than ours. In part 2, I'll be looking at the UN Climate Change Report's assessment of the National Adaptation Plans, the Adaptation Fund, and the Clean Development Mechanism. Until then, thanks very much for watching, have a great week, and remember to just have a think. See you in part 2.